Welcome to Episode 5 of The Making of Pakistan, Unpacking the Roots of a Nation, where we explore Chapter 4 of K.K. Aziz's influential work. In this episode, we examine how religion, particularly Islam and Hinduism, shapes political identities and nationalist movements in colonial India. So we're taking a deep dive today into the source material you've shared with us, focusing specifically on Chapter 4 of Aziz's book, which he titles The Religious Factor. Our mission is to really dig into this text and try to understand how, in Aziz's view, religion became such a foundational and sometimes, well, contradictory element in the political landscape leading up to the making of Pakistan.
That's right. And Aziz, he doesn't just jump straight into India, does he? He starts with a broader observation.
Yeah, what's that?
That religion is, and historically has been, an incredibly powerful force for bonding people together. A fundamental glue, really.
A fundamental glue. I like that. He suggests communal solidarity and even national unity often spring from these deeply held religious roots.
He mentions that idea, maybe an extreme one, that national states are basically political church organizations.
Right, but he acknowledges that even if you don't go that far, many, perhaps most, nascent national movements find their energy, their driving force in a religious background.
And he explains why that might be. Religion can offer a sense of supernatural authority for unity, that feeling that, God wills it.
A higher purpose.
Exactly. And it serves as a powerful symbol or sanction of that unity. It gives people shared pride, courage, especially when other forms of identity are maybe still forming.
And he points out this isn't just an Indian thing. You see it historically all over the world. He gives examples.
Yeah, loads of them. The Greek church and Greek nationalism, the Scottish Kirk, Jewish Zionism, obviously deeply rooted in religious identity.
Irish Catholicism, Burmese Buddhism.
Yeah.
It just keeps coming up. It's a recurring theme he establishes.
And he also highlights how religion can act as a kind of defense mechanism. This is important, especially for groups feeling, well, weaker or under threat.
Like minorities.
Precisely. He mentions Islam in India facing the, dominant Hindu majority, or Buddhism in Ceylon, Catholicism in Prussian Poland. It gives cohesion.
He even brings in Mazzini, right? The God and the People slogan.
Yeah, a perfect example of blending religious appeal with that kind of national fervor. It wasn't just politics, it was tied to something bigger.
So Aziz argues this religious influence actually shapes the national character, the habits of a people.
It does, and depending on history, it can unify or divide. In places like Holland or England, with strong states, the majority religion often got integrated, became part of the establishment,
Right, but then in places like, say, Germany, where maybe there wasn't one single dominant religion nationally.
Then it could be divisive. He even points to historical tensions between Catholics and Protestants in England, just to show it's complex everywhere.
So the takeaway for understanding India, according to Aziz, is that you have to grasp how fundamental religion was. Across the board, it shaped everything.
Absolutely. You can't understand the politics without understanding the religious dimension, in his view.
Okay, and that's where he introduces what he sees as the critical difference in the Indian context, the religious divide itself.
Exactly. He draws a very sharp line here. He says, look, this isn't like Catholicism and Protestantism, which he sees as, branches of the same tree, variations of Christianity.
Okay.
Hinduism and Islam, he argues, are fundamentally different. His words are stark. Two distinct creeds with not a single attribute in common.
Wow. Okay, so completely separate systems in his analysis.
That's how he frames it. And he presents this fundamental difference as the key to understanding the acerbity, the bitterness, the intensity of the conflict between Hindus and Muslims in India, different from religious tensions elsewhere.
Because the gap was just so wide, in his view.
That's the argument. He sees this as the bedrock split that really sets the stage for two distinct nationalisms to emerge.
Right. So let's unpack how Aziz looks at the Hindu side of this equation first.
Okay. He presents the perspective, and it's important to say this is the perspective in the source, that the history of India is fundamentally the history of the Hindu people.
And he describes early Hindu patriotism as having these, well, mystical and even racial elements.
Yes.
Specifically anti-British.
Yes, and almost deifying the land, Mother Earth. Patriotic duty framed as a religious duty to God. And enemies weren't just political opponents.
They were asuras. Like the demons from mythology.
Exactly, which suggests a really deep, almost existential level of opposition. He also talks about the religious personification of nationalism, linking it to figures like Krishna.
And early movements.
He points to the Arya Samaj, noting it opposed Islam with bitterness and Christianity with vigor. And the Bengali revolutionary movement, he says, had this strong, renascent Hindu ideology, their aim, a Hindu Raj, Hindu rule, getting rid of the British to achieve it.
He also mentions Tilak society in Pune. Their goal was the removal of obstacles to the Hindu religion.
And Aziz notes that, according to them, Muslims and the British were right at the top of that list of obstacles.
So Aziz builds this case that the whole outlook of the Congress Party, despite claiming unity and secularism, was fundamentally Hindu in its orientation.
That's his argument. He suggests Swaraj, self-government, really meant Hindu rule to many involved. He points to things like the Ramayana being used as a source of national unity, or S.C. Bose using Hindu terms and figures in political discussions back in the 1920s.
And then there's Gandhi. Aziz spends a lot of time on Gandhi's role.
He does. He views Gandhi's main technique, satyagraha, as just deeply rooted in Hindu philosophy. He even quotes Gandhi saying it was the only way to keep Hinduism alive and India undivided.
Wow. And Aziz highlights specific Hindu practices Gandhi brought into the movement.
Yes, things like mass singing of Ramdon beating symbols. Gandhi framed these not just as religious acts, but as vital for discipline in nonviolence, like a physical drill for an army.
Okay.
And he emphasizes that Gandhi presented satyagraha and ahimsa, nonviolence, as ancient Hindu concepts, stating ahimsa was so fundamental, if it vanished, Hindu religion itself would vanish.
And cow protection.
Aziz singles that out. Gandhi called it the dearest possession, the central fact, specifically the gift of Hinduism.
Aziz also mentions Gandhi's view on the song Bande Mataram.
Right. A song Aziz describes as rabidly anti-Muslim, yet Gandhi apparently found it had wonderful associations and expressed the one national wish. It's a stark contrast presented there.
And the Gandhian Constitution proposal from 45.
Aziz points out it was based explicitly and purely on Hindu sources, Ramayana, Mahabharata, and so on. And Gandhi himself wrote a positive foreword for the book detailing it.
So, synthesizing this, Aziz's core argument about Gandhi is
that Gandhi sanctified politics, yes, but in doing so, he effectively made it a social version of the Hindu faith, using Hindu terms Swaraj, Satyagraha, Ramraja, Bharat Mata, Ahimsa, instead of, say, Western political terms.
And Aziz makes the provocative suggestion that the masses followed Gandhi not just as a nationalist leader,
but as a saint, a Hindu metaphysician, that they saw the whole movement through a religious lens, regardless of Congress's official secular line.
Which leads to a really striking critique Aziz makes. He challenges Congress's claim to unity and secularism.
He does. He argues its nationalism was as much grounded in Hinduism as was Muslim nationalism in Islam.
And then comes that comparison with Jinnah.
Yes, this is quite pointed in the source. Aziz puts forward the view that Jinnah might have been, in a way, more liberal and secular than Gandhi.
How so?
Because, Aziz suggests, Jinnah was upfront, he led Muslims, and Islam was openly the basis of his nationalism, whereas Gandhi claimed to lead all Indians on a secular basis, but in Aziz's analysis, deeply embedded the movement in Hindu terms, symbols, and philosophy.
It's definitely a challenging perspective presented in the source. It highlights that tension between stated ideals and maybe the underlying cultural reality as Aziz saw it.
Exactly, but then, just as you think you've got his argument pinned down, Aziz throws in a curveball.
Oh, what's that?
He argues that, theoretically speaking, both Hinduism and Islam were actually, well, incompatible with the whole philosophy of modern nationalism.
Wait, hang on. He just spent all this time showing how religion fueled nationalism, and now he says they were theoretically against it. That seems contradictory.
It does on the surface, but let's see how he explains it. He looks at each one. For Hinduism, he points to the caste system.
Okay.
The traditional emphasis, he argues, was loyalty to your specific caste, not the nation as a whole. The system itself was anti-national in essence, he claims. Unity didn't really go beyond caste unity. It lacked those key ingredients for modern nationalism, unity, liberty, equality, fraternity.
So the inherent hierarchy worked against a unified national feeling.
That's the idea. He suggests the political system that seemed most aligned with Hinduism was maybe a ruling caste system. He even mentions historical examples like resistance to invaders or the Maratha movement, where he felt Brahmanism didn't quite translate into a broader cross-caste patriotism.
Okay, and what about Islam's theoretical incompatibility?
For Islam, the traditional centuries-old view is the Ummah, the single global community of all Muslims. The idea of states based on specific territories, or nations as developed in the West, wasn't the historical norm. Muslim states were often vast, multinational empires. Loyalty was to the Ummah, not necessarily a specific nation-state.
So if both were theoretically tricky, how did territorial nationalism actually take root in India for either group?
Aziz contrasts how it happened. Hindus, he says, having deep roots in the land of India itself, picked up the Western idea of territorial nationalism relatively quickly. India as the homeland made immediate sense.
Made sense? And Muslims?
Muslims, he argues, held onto that traditional non-territorial view of the Ummah for much longer. They didn't automatically think in terms of a specific Muslim territory within India.
So when did that shift happen, according to Aziz?
He pinpoints it much later, really gaining momentum in the 1930s. That's when the idea of a separate state tied to a specific territory starts to seriously intrude into mainstream Muslim political thinking in India.
And even then, it wasn't universally accepted within the community.
Not at all. Aziz stresses there was significant pushback from the orthodox religious scholars, the ulama. Many saw territorial nationalism as fundamentally un-Islamic.
Really?
Yeah, he quotes figures like Maududi, who argued vehemently against it, called nationalism things like selfishness, blind prejudice, cruel pride. Maududi apparently dismissed the very term Muslim nationalism as a contradiction, like calling someone a chaste prostitute. Strong words.
Wow. So Muslim nationalists were fighting battles on multiple fronts.
Absolutely. Aziz points this out clearly. They were up against the British, yes, up against the Hindu-dominated Congress, yes, but also facing powerful anti-nationalist arguments from within their own religious community.
And the irony is?
The irony, perhaps, is that their most potent weapon against that internal religious opposition was often an appeal to Islam itself, using religion to justify a political concept some religious leaders rejected. It's complex.
Beyond the theory, Aziz also talks about practical issues within the Muslim community that he thinks slowed down the growth of nationalism.
Yes, several internal factors he identifies. One was education. Muslims generally lagged behind Hindus in accessing modern education.
And the effect of that?
Aziz argues it just made it harder to spread the nationalist message, the political arguments, effectively through the community. He suggests Sayyid Ahmad Khan's big push for education should be partly seen in this light, needing an educated base to engage politically.
Okay. What else?
The status of women. Aziz is quite blunt here. With nearly half the population often restricted from public life, the national message simply couldn't travel as fast or as wide.
He mentions orthodox opposition to things like women voting.
Right. Figures like Maududi opposing female suffrage, and just a general reluctance in conservative circles towards female emancipation, which acted as a brake, in Aziz's view.
I also makes an interesting point about caste among Muslims.
Yes, this is fascinating. He argues that many Indian Muslims had, over time, borrowed and adopted aspects of the Hindu caste system into their own social structures.
But isn't Islam supposed to be egalitarian?
Theoretically, yes. Equality and fraternity are core tenets. But Aziz argues the practice in parts of India involved caste-like divisions. He calls this a crippling handicap for national unity, as it created internal hierarchies totally at odds with Islam's message, and crucially, hindered the solidarity needed for nationalism.
And the final factor he mentions?
Conservatism. A general conservatism. He suggests the influence of orthodox teaching sometimes stifled free inquiry and critical thinking. The ulama, he notes, could use religion to resist social change. He gives an example of opposing compulsory education on a religious grounds.
So an intellectual stagnation.
In some ways, yes. He describes a bias against independent research, even mentioning someone like Iqbal feeling its effects. Society felt static, intellectually, mentally. Feudalism was rampant. Leadership often came from landlords. Jinnah being a key exception there, Aziz concludes it just wasn't congenial soil for nationalism to flourish quickly. It took the big political shocks of the 1930s to really kickstart things.
Okay, let's shift gears now. Aziz uses the Khilafat movement as a major case study, doesn't he, to show religious feeling in politics?
Absolutely. It's a pivotal moment in his analysis. This was all about the fate of the Ottoman Empire after World War I.
And why did Indian Muslims care so much about the Ottoman Sultan?
Well, for Sunni Muslims particularly, the Sultan was also the Khalifa, the symbolic, spiritual head of global Islam. His position, the integrity of his empire, held huge religious and emotional weight. Even Shias often saw the Ottoman Empire as the last major independent Muslim power, so its fate mattered.
And British policy had changed toward the Ottomans.
Yes, Britain was no longer propping them up against Russia. Post-war, European powers were carving up Ottoman lands. Many Indian Muslims saw this not just as geopolitics, but as part of a deliberate plan to destroy Islam, a coordinated attack.
So the movement's cause was driven by concern for the Khalifa's status and the Ottoman Empire's survival.
Deep concern. It reached fever pitch with the Treaty of Sèvres in 1920, which proposed incredibly harsh terms, basically dismantling the empire. That really galvanized the movement.
And they took action. Boycotts, non-cooperation.
Yes, large-scale campaigns. Aziz stresses the intensity of feeling. The British were widely seen as the enemy of Islam. There were real fears India could become like Ireland, facing similar struggles. British observers were genuinely struck by how deep this anti-British sentiment ran, driven by the Khilafat issue.
Now, Aziz highlights something he calls a remarkable development here, the Hindu-Muslim alliance.
That's right. Forged largely through Gandhi's active support for the Khilafat cause, Gandhi saw it, famously, as a golden opportunity of uniting the two peoples.
So they worked together on this, and against the 1919 reforms.
Yes, this cooperation was a new phenomenon. But, Aziz argues, it ultimately created false hopes. It didn't last.
Right. So what's Aziz's assessment of the Khilafat movement's overall impact? Let's start with the positives he identifies.
Okay, on the credit side, he says it definitely trained Muslims in modern political organization and action. It brought together different factions, extremists, moderates for a common goal.
Okay.
They achieved a level of coordinated action, public mobilization, even international publicity that was new for them. And crucially, he argues, it shattered the old myth of unwavering Muslim loyalty to the British Raj. It changed the game politically.
But there's a significant downside in his analysis.
Oh, yes. He's quite critical of the long-term results. He calls the Hindu-Muslim unity a marriage of convenience. Ultimately, he says it was unproductive because the cracks appeared very quickly. And he argues the experience taught many Muslims that the underlying differences between the communities were just too deep to be bridged. He makes the strong claim that the movement ended up underlining the basic Hindu-Muslim schism, which nothing could heal.
A strong statement.
Very. He notes that after Khilafat, the two communities never really joined forces against the British in that same unified way again.
What about the leadership that emerged from the movement?
Aziz feels that while they were effective at rousing emotions, they weren't necessarily the first-class strategic leaders needed for the long haul. He kind of dismisses the movement politically as a pointless interlude in the years immediately after, leading to a bit of a political lull.
And despite the initial success of unity,
Muslims fragmented again afterwards. Aziz observes they seemed only able to unite when facing what they perceived as dire danger.
and this seems key, he does see a permanent contribution.
Yes, and this is crucial to his overall argument about Muslim nationalism. He says, by focusing so intensely on Islam, on the Khalifa, the movement undeniably made Indian Muslims feel Muslims first and Indians afterwards.
Oh, reinforcing that distinct identity.
Exactly. He sees this, perhaps paradoxically given the movement's political failure, as a major triumph for Muslim nationalism. It laid an essential emotional and identity groundwork for future unity, something historians, he insists, cannot ignore.
Okay. Now, related to Khilafat, Aziz also discusses Pan-Islamism. What was that about?
Pan-Islamism is this doctrine, often associated with figures like Jamaluddin Afghani or later Ottoman leaders. The basic idea is that Muslims worldwide are one brotherhood, the Ummah, and should unite to defend themselves against anti-Islam forces or influences.
Was it a concrete political plan?
Aziz suggests it was often more of a shared feeling, a powerful slogan, rather than a practical blueprint for action, though he concedes it provided a modicum of the sentiment behind the Khilafat movement.
And why was it particularly appealing in India?
For the Muslim minority, Aziz argues, it served as a kind of defensive attitude. Facing the growing tide of Hindu nationalism, it was a way to look outwards, to feel connected to and potentially seek solidarity from co-religionists across the globe against perceived Hindu domination. A source of psychological strength, perhaps.
How was it viewed outside India? By the British, for example.
Often with great suspicion. The British and other Europeans tended to see it as a potential threat, maybe a bluff, or just dangerous fanaticism. There was this underlying fear of Islam as a conquering creed, worries about some kind of political bloc forming between, say, Lahore and Constantinople.
But there was another way to see it.
Yes, Aziz presents the alternative view that Pan-Islamism wasn't aggressive, but rather reawakened by perceived Christian aggression. You know, the relentless expansion of European colonial powers into Muslim lands worldwide. From that perspective, it looked like Muslims reacting to a relentless Christian crusade.
So how did this whole Pan-Islamist idea actually affect Muslim nationalism within India? According to Aziz, was it helpful?
He argues, quite strongly, that it was ultimately more of a liability than an asset.
Really? Why?
Well, first, it definitely earned them hostility from European powers, especially Britain. Second, despite the hopes, it didn't actually deliver any tangible support from other Muslim countries. Third, it alienated some potentially sympathetic British commentators.
And what about the impact on Hindus?
That was another major liability. It frightened some Hindus. They suspected hidden imperialist ambitions or even worried about a potential Muslim invasion from the northwest, backed by other Muslim powers. Aziz notes this fear was later explicitly used as an argument against the creation of Pakistan. So Pan-Islamism created problems on multiple fronts.
Okay, one final external factor Aziz brings in, the Christian viewpoint.
Yes, he argues that some people in Britain, particularly those with strong religious convictions, saw British imperialism partly as a vehicle for spreading Christianity. India, in this view, was a kind of spiritual battleground between Christianity and Islam.
And this influenced policy or attitudes.
He points to figures like Herbert Edwards, an administrator who advocated teaching the Bible in government schools, and petitions supporting this. The idea was that British policy should favor Christianity, and that purely secular education was potentially dangerous, leading to infidelity.
And this led to taking sides in the Hindu-Muslim dynamic.
Aziz suggests that some British teachers, officials, and particularly Christian priests or missionaries showed a clear partiality towards Hindus and the Congress, essentially siding with Hinduism against Islam.
Why would they do that?
Aziz offers a few potential reasons. Maybe because both Christianity and Islam were proselytizing faiths, unlike Hinduism, creating a sense of rivalry. Or perhaps it stemmed from the general hostility towards Pan-Islamism we just discussed. He cites specific figures like Monier Williams and Sir William Muir, who held quite negative views of Islam, seeing it as an enemy of civilization.
He even mentions Christian conversion being suggested as a solution.
Yes, the rather extreme idea was floated that converting Indians to Christianity could resolve the Hindu-Muslim conflict.
So what were the consequences of this particular Christian attitude for Muslim nationalism, in Aziz's view?
He's careful to say this wasn't necessarily the only or even the dominant British view, but where this attitude did exist, he argues it had several effects. First, it created unsolicited hostility towards Muslims, which could ironically strengthen the hand of Muslim extremists by giving them a clear other to react against.
Yeah.
Second, it pushed Muslims towards consolidating their own identity in self-defense, perhaps becoming more religious, maybe even fanatical, as he puts it, in reaction.
He also sees it as a form of divide and rule.
A minor and vicarious example, yes, where Christians distinguished between the communities and implicitly or explicitly favored Hindus over Muslims, thus reinforcing the divide.
And finally,
It put Muslims on the defensive, maybe reinforcing conservatism. But paradoxically, by providing this external religious opposition, it also acted as a catalyst, quickening their own sense of nationalism by forcing them to close their ranks. Another complex, unintended consequence.
right, so let's try and wrap up this deep dive into Aziz's fourth chapter.
Yeah.
It's incredibly dense.
It really is.
What's clear is that he presents religion in colonial India not simply as a matter of personal faith. It was absolutely central, a complex, often contradictory force that fundamentally shaped political identities, loyalties, and the movements that emerged.
Definitely. He makes a very strong case, again, from his perspective, that both Hindu nationalism and Muslim nationalism drew heavily on religious identity for their meaning and power.
Even while, as he argues quite fascinatingly, the core tenets of both religions might have theoretically been at odds with modern territorial nationalism.
That's a key tension he explores. We've looked at how he portrays the unique, deep nature of the Hindu-Muslim divide itself.
Yeah, and the internal challenges within each community, the impact of caste, conservatism, education gaps, the status of women.
And that crucial, brief, but ultimately failed moment of interreligious political unity during the Khilafat Movement, a real turning point in his narrative.
Plus the impact of external views, British strategic concerns, Pan-Islamism, and that specific Christian perspective he identifies.
Absolutely. Understanding this deeply religious foundation, this complex interplay as Aziz lays it out, really does provide essential context, doesn't it, for making sense of the political path taken, the conflicts that arose, and the eventual outcomes in the region.
It certainly does. Thank you for sharing this fascinating, challenging source material and taking this deep dive with us today. It's given us a lot to think about.
My pleasure. And perhaps as we finish, here's a question for you, the listener, to ponder. This chapter vividly shows how asserting religious identity became so deeply tangled up with political demands and national aspirations in colonial India. Given all the complexities, the tensions, the deep divisions Aziz highlights, what questions does this raise for you about the ongoing relationship between religious identity and national identity? Not just historically, but as you see it playing out in different parts of our world today.
A very relevant question indeed. A lot to mull over there.
We hope this deep dive has been insightful for you. Please do keep sending us the materials you'd like us to explore together in future deep dives.